This is Phil Forway. Today I am going to talk about a noise album which I have been excited talking about for a while now. It is Retrace No Steps by Toepfer, released in 2021 on CD via White Centipede Noise. Toepfer is a Canadian sound artist working in the fields of electronic noise and sound manipulation, releasing music sporadically over the last 10 years with a recent tape on Abhorrent AD, which is also extremely good. The CD comes in a single-sided gatefold digipack and has some sparse but intriguing artwork which fits the noise perfectly. Ghostly images that look to me like glimpses through space and time, with textures that resemble objects I know but presented in a very contextless manner. The CD itself is completely black with only the hub ring showing the artist name and the title. It holds 9 pieces in various lengths and is about 50 minutes long. First track on the CD, Exegesis, Headstand. Even though the first piece starts out with what could be heard as an alarm clock, the first half of Exegesis couldn't be further away from a typical first track of an album, since there's no action taken to trigger any imminent effect at all, consciously so. The piece riffs on an arrangement of high to mid-range sonical artifacts without any shift in intensity whatsoever for the majority of this track, certainly playing with the expectations of the listener who's awaiting some kind of progress or narrative elements. There is no release for the longest time, but this strangely unfulfilling arrangement of sound, which, in its contextual unusualness, is very intriguing in that it just exists. In fact, it almost sounds like it's about to fade. Something like a break with sounds reminiscent to ghostly strings preamble somewhat of a noise blast in the last fifth of the piece. But noise blast is way too big of a word since it's merely a brief shift in volume that quickly loses itself again in modulated static. Second piece, Ample Stack. The modulated static keeps dropping out and coming back in, leaving a wake of artifacts and oscillated shimmer sounds. The noise is being worked much more dynamically in the second third, giving the piece somewhat of a faster tempo, but still the sounds are existing merely on the threshold of satisfaction. Something is deliberately lacking, and it's not just mid-low to low frequency information. Halfway through, the piece grows more fragmented, different textures are being thrown at the listener, noise is being treated on the cusp of fuzz and silence. I can't even tell how the sound is being produced. Could be electronically pushing a gate or concrete sounds. Track 3. Sufficiently workable substitutes. The piece carries the torch of the previous pieces. Low noise rumbles and high chirps give somewhat of a familiar touch point for the listener, but all with that gray, unsaturated sound aesthetic. This doesn't last long before sound info drops out and comes in again in a controlled, non-sequenced fashion. The interesting thing is that sounds are being dropped out and are about to be brought back, what feels like, but instead they're just simmering on this barely audible but super intense gain stage. I'm having the feeling that the looming, suppressed sound is about to burst my ears off any second, but it just won't happen, and it riffs on this what feels like forever. It's almost punishing in the way it keeps negating the expectations of my ear and brain. It's awesome. Next track, Artifice. We're being presented a new setting in the shape of a very reduced scene with modern Rita-esque pops and crackles in a roomy ambience. It's the first time on this CD in which sound doesn't feel close and omnipresent, but that we stumbled upon it and are merely witnessing it than it being a part of the listener's reality by being played back via the sound medium. This is one of my favorite parts on this release. This doesn't go for very long though, since halfway through the piece we're abruptly getting some more of that sweet brittle noise, only this time heavier, fuzzier and more wall-like in performance and dynamics. The two main parts of this piece stand in heavy contrast to each other, which is cool. But I really like the pops and crackles part, and I'd have loved to have given a little more time to explore it a little further. But here we are again with subverting listeners' expectations. Fifth piece, Conceit, Dispel. The piece forms somewhat of the centerpiece of the CD in that it takes the sounds we heard being incorporated and fleshed out in the previous pieces and uses them in a highly dynamic noise performance which immediately grabs the attention of the listener and takes them on a ride rather than providing a setting to explore. There is occasional elements being added and subtracted in the first half, but it mainly riffs on sound info we heard in the previous tracks, albeit in a more grindy and spastic performance. Halfway through, Toepfer briefly introduces high register mixing feedback sounds, which for me personally invoke the image of a moth making their way out of a crusty ass cocoon with all its radical movements. I don't know why, but it just jumped at me that way. Also, in this piece, the mid-heavy mix of this record makes the attack in sound very hard and violent in its dry nature. Since the sound isn't traditionally well balanced but is very purposely devoid of certain frequencies, this feels like being clubbed to submission with a wooden appliance, but more in sound, not in imagery. This isn't a violent or dominant record at all so far. The track ends with a turtle curveball, presenting some eerie droning power electronics that just keep riffing on some delay-heavy, multi-layered industrial noise that seems so clean and sterile in comparison to the rest of the track, which comes off fairly dusty and dirty. The outro caught me off guard a little and it just went by so quickly. It kept me wanting more. Next track, Less and Even Less. Latest now, it's apparent that the artist really understands his possibilities and capabilities with pacing and sequencing on this album, as he's utilizing these elements in full capacity. Less and Even Less is the perfect come down after such a dynamic noise session Conceit Dispel was. A breather even. The piece comes in with low rhythmic droning that holds more pure frequency than actual sound. Static noise jabs pick up and appear in tandem with ethereal reverb residue, playing on quiet loud dynamics and giving the piece somewhat of a narrative element. It portrays a feeling of waking up almost, but more from the side of sleep, in which jabs of reality tear the realm of dreams apart. It's the shortest track on the album with 3 minutes, but it packs quite a lot of punch regarding content and composition. Misremembrance. The piece introduces a new element to the record, and that of an almost rhythmic and tonal, seemingly loop-based mechanical arrangement of samples and sounds. This is probably the most materialistic this album gets in its clarity and transparency of sound and concept. It doesn't pick up the surreality of the previous pieces so much, but introduces a certain starkness through mechanical rhythm and repetition. However, this is being broken up by a more scooped version of the brittle wall noise this release throws in various versions shortly after. The listener is once again being taken out of that moment of clarity, being put back into this limbo of strangeness. The piece ends with a modulated rotating sound that arises out of the rumble, like it is the backbone of this piece. It's not a too different of an approach to the previous piece, and it's generally apparent that the latter half of this release exists in a generally more dynamic direction than the first half, which was more extreme and uncompromising in composition, but it is an interesting piece nonetheless. Track 8, largely a matter of accident. Just when I thought the artist moves in a more narrative-driven direction, the further we're moving into the track list, the more I was pleasantly surprised that we seem to come full circle here. The piece picks up the approach of pure display of sound, presenting a sculpture with elements we already heard in the beginning of this CD, albeit a little more transparent and poised in execution. There is several moving parts. The piece is dynamic in its flesh and blood, but unchanging in general performance. The piece itself may not have a narrative arc, but it is a narrative piece in the grand scheme, establishing the noise we hear as something of a leitmotif, feels like. I was pleasantly surprised when I realized that I heard this texture and arrangement before. It engaged me on a very rewarding level after being gate-kept with the sheer unknowableness of the CD so far. Like, I have been here before. Like, maybe I can navigate this now, draw a map, focus on more and more details now that I am a part of this world. Last piece on the CD, largely a matter of accident. This piece is a perfect palate cleanser after such an intense ride Retrace No Steps has been until now. It's by far the heaviest piece, rumbling, fluid, harsh noise that takes a bucket of detergent and dumps it over the painting the artist created until now, mixing all elements and have them reacting with each other, bubbling, fuming, disintegrating. The gray and surreal dreamscape we've been navigating the previous 45 minutes is collapsing and buries the listener in its rubble until we start again anew. General feeling. I've been very excited about reviewing this since I am usually amping up the time I spent with the release before starting to script it out and such, and I already knew that this would be a very rewarding process. The record, as mentioned a couple of times already, has a very special air about it. There's 0 to none elements that cater the expectations one might have towards a harsh noise release. Maybe because KM Toepfer shows a very unique attitude towards the term of the genre itself. The artist presents harsh noise as in the noises he uses are harsh, unmusical and radical in nature, and he constructs pieces with these elements in a very sovereign, precise manner, creating a very special brand of excellence and singularity that is truly unique. Not harsh noise as in we're throwing a bunch of concrete sounds together and squeeze it through a fuzz pedal to give it a vibe and have the tape compression do the rest. Don't get me wrong, great results are being achieved through that kind of work set, but it's apparent that even in a very abstract genre, this is left field and unfuckwithable. The album executes the concept of surrealism in conceptual sound in a very old school manner, in that it's radically using sounds and arrangements that are obviously created to negate the listener's expectations. There's no real bass information present on the whole thing, no shrill info either. There's no catharsis or transcendence in all the narration and progress of the record. It's devoid of any logical composition whatsoever, and it's so intriguing and eerie if you decide to give it a chance. Because frankly, I can understand if it turns people off. Speaking of eerie, this is by far the most ghostly noise album I've heard in a while. And here's a little anecdote. In film, I find the usual tropes of how ghosts are being portrayed very corny due to being so close to our concept of life still. And I haven't to this day seen an adequate representation that depicts ghosts as these unknowable spirits that they are. But this album somehow gave me that kind of unconfused unknowingness about something I just can't fathom. It's hard to explain, but there is an element that feels like I will never ever grasp, and that's exciting. Thank you KM Toepfer and the label for this release, and thank you dear viewer. See you next time.